And today we'll discuss political institutions and policy making. And to understand public policy, shall I do this? To understand public policy, we must know how policy decisions are made, right? And we need to understand where power is effectively located in different political systems. Apparently, entities with certain power can decide policies. So we need to actually locate actors with power, right, within political system. We need to know what it takes to change public policy. That is, there is a current policy or status quo, and if we want to change it, how much resources do we need? Say, within the government, does it take simply a simple majority rule to change the status quo? Or does it take more? Now, the interaction between government and citizens is a two-way process. This is what this figure portrays, including an upward flow of influence and demands from the society, which we call the process of interest articulation. Okay, thank you. As well as downward flow of decisions from the government, which is what we will be discussing today, policy making. Okay? So upward arrow represents influence and demands, and downward arrow represents government decisions. Okay? Government decisions are policies. Okay? So that's what we are discussing today. So people demand what they want, and government delivers what they decide. Okay? Parties, interest groups, and other social groups may be very active in articulating and aggregating interests, but government agencies are at the core of policymaking. So from today on, we are mainly interested in the government, okay, rather than interest groups or parties. Government officials, legislators, and their staffs actually initiate and formulate policy proposals. And with that in mind, we first discuss the decision rules of policy making. So to understand policy and how policies are made, we need to know the rules governing policy making, right? And most of those rules are in the book called Constitution. Okay? And a constitution or constitutions are the basic rules concerning decision making. Here the decision making means policy making, rights, individual rights and freedoms, and the distribution of authority in a political system. So within a political system or within a government, how the power is distributed, so who has what power, kind of thing. Those things are described in the Constitution. Another way to say exactly the same thing is that a Constitution is a set of rules, principles, customs, and practices, whether it is a specific written document or not. Oh, so this one was previous one. Well, the end part of this definition shows that there are constitutions that are not formally written, right? And let's talk about written ones. Written or codified, the same thing. Constitutions are particularly important in political systems based on the rule of law, what we call 법치, right? This means that government can take no action that has not been authorized by law. So government can do only the things that Constitution or other laws allow them to. So unless it is specifically stated, government cannot commit that act. Okay? So government is quite restrained here. It also means that citizens cannot be punished or can be punished only for actions that violate an existing law. That is, government cannot arbitrarily punish us for our wrongdoings. We can only be punished for the things that are specifically written in the law. Okay? We may do something immoral, but government cannot punish us just because it's immoral, as long as the law doesn't say anything about it. Okay? That's why we commit so many immoral things, right? And under a codified constitution, the constitution is the supreme body of law, meaning that the constitution supersedes any other laws. So when there's a conflict between the constitution and some other law passed by the national legislature, constitution always wins. Okay? That's why we talk about the constitutionality of laws being passed by National Assembly. And a constitution contains a set of decision rules the basic rules governing how decisions are made. The Constitution tells us how policy decisions are made. Setting up agencies and offices with specific powers. So Constitution creates different governmental organizations and branches and give them different powers. And then assigning them territorial and functional jurisdiction and the like. So Constitution specifies, say, judicial branch does this, legislative branch does this. So Constitution gives each government entities territorial and functional jurisdiction. Perhaps the most important rules that constitutions establish are those that govern the policy-making process. And policy making is the process to transform social interests and demands into authoritative public decisions. We call this process policy making. So turn social interests and demands, what people articulated into authoritative public decisions. As you remember, political decisions are 1, public, 2, authoritative, right? And these decisions become policies or laws. And constitutions give the power to propose policies to specific groups or institutions. So in the process of policy making, there are different powers. And Constitution give, say, proposal power to a certain agency, and they give others the right to amend, reject, or approve such proposals. So certain entity may get amendment power, or refusal power, or approval power. And certain entities may get final decision-making power. And other agencies may get the power to implement, police, and adjudicate them. Obviously, the adjudication power goes to the judicial branch, right? And within any given branch of government, there are numerous rules that affect the policy-making process. And the most important of these rules are voting rules. That is, oftentimes when policymakers make policies, they vote too, right? So we need to understand their own voting rules. Now, in most modern legislature and in many courts, okay, the judicial branch, voting rules are egalitarian. So in the legislature and the courts, mostly, voting rules are egalitarian. This means each member has the same voting power. One person, one vote. So in the National Assembly, we have 300 National Assembly persons, and whenever they for or against a bill, they have just one vote, right? One vote each. And if the bill gets 151 votes, the bill passes, right? Same is the case with the courts, especially the Supreme Courts, right? And in the case of Korea, constitutional courts also votes, right? We know that the Korean Constitutional Court voted to reverse the impeachment of President Roh Moo-hyun, right? So they voted. They didn't let us know the exact voting outcome. So we do not know how many voted for or against, but we do know that they reversed the impeachment decision. So in the legislature and the courts, voting rules tend to be egalitarian, but this is hardly ever true in government departments or ministries. Meaning that in the executive branch, voting rules are not egalitarian. There is no such thing as one person, one vote there, okay? Their decision making is hierarchical. You've heard of the term hierarchy, right? And everybody is supposed to defer to his or her superior. So you look at your 상관, and usually because your superior, 상관, makes the decision. You just do what you are told to. Okay? In a pure hierarchy, only the vote of a person at the very top counts. That is, in a pure hierarchy, say only the minister's vote counts. There's only one vote. Say in a Ministry of Education, if it is run as a pure hierarchy, then the education minister's one vote decides, say, educational policy. That is, if it is run as a pure hierarchy. A real-world example could be the National Security Council in both Korea and the US, but let's talk about US. National Security Council attached to the White House. At the time of, say, national crisis, while the security of the country is at stake, National Security Council meets and makes very important decisions. So, Secretary of Defense is member of the National Security Council, the Secretary of State, the head of the CIA, many presidential aides, and of course, President and Vice President are all members of National Security Council. However, everybody else's role in the National Security Council is to give advice to the president. And ultimate decision is in the hand of the president. Okay? We all know that the U.S. invaded Iraq and eventually got rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, during the George W. Bush era, right? I'm sure that there are tens of so-called neocons who supported the decision to invade Iraq. However, the history will say that the Iraqi invasion or Iraqi war was George W. Bush's war because he was the U.S. president at the time, and he was head of the National Security Council. Okay? So everybody else just becomes advisor, and president's opinion is the only one that counts. Okay? Okay, going back to the decision rules. Many political institutions adopt simple majority rule, which means whichever proposal gets the majority votes wins. And, well, this is how we operate all the time in non-political setting too, right? In most cases, we use simple majority rule. Even when you guys decide whether you guys should have 짜장면 or 짬뽕 today, you guys vote, and whichever group has a simple majority may win, right? So that's probably the single most frequently used voting rule in the world. But that is not the only rule, right? Supra-majority rules, such as 2/3 rule or 3/4 rule, are something adopted for particularly important decisions. For example, the U.S. Constitution requires 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress in order to amend the Constitution or to override a presidential veto. Exactly the same is the case in Korea. To amend the Constitution, first of all, National Assembly must pass it by 2/3 vote, not a simple majority vote. Of course, that is not the end of the process. To amend the Constitution, it's a two-stage process, right? First, the amendment goes to the National Assembly, but if it passed there, the second stage is 국민투표와 national referendum, right? And also in Korea, to say if the president vetoes a certain bill passed by National Assembly, National Assembly can override the presidential veto, but to do so, you need 2/3 vote instead of a simple majority. Obviously, the most extreme voting rule is unanimity rule. Everybody must agree, okay? Otherwise, change does not happen. Which also means that any one member can block any decision, right? Everybody becomes a veto person, okay? So supra-majority rules means it is less likely to make any decision, while status quo is stable. Now, since I cannot go over there, I'm going to point from here, okay? It's a simple majority rule over there. And then we can move over to the extreme case of unanimity rule. And those are not dots, they are on the continuum, okay? The simple majority rule to unanimity rule. Theoretically, the self-majority rule is possible. You can pass something with less than simple majority rule, but it's rarely used. And if you think about it, it is sort of a dictatorial or authoritarian system, because if you can pass anything with one vote, then one dictator can change anything, right? So let's forget about self-majority voting, and starting with simple majority rule, well, collecting a simple majority of members of a voting body is relatively easy, right? But as we move from simple majority rule to unanimity rule, change becomes more and more difficult. And with unanimity rule, change becomes almost impossible, because the chances are, say, all 50 million Koreans are voting for a certain issue. Well, I'm sure that there will be, it would be easy to find one person who objects, right? And if one person objects out of 50 million, that change does not happen. Okay. So, moving from simple majority rule to unanimity rule, status quo becomes more and more stable, hard to change. So change becomes more difficult. And the thing that I always talk about, rational choice, rational expectations, we can foresee what's going to happen in the future under certain circumstances. What I'm trying to say is that somebody will have to decide this decision rule, right? Decision rule is not given by the God. We decide decision rule. And we now know that it's easy to change the status quo with simple majority rule. It's almost impossible to change the status quo with unanimity rule. Therefore, when we decide the decision rule, if you like the status quo, you should insist on supramajority rule or unanimity rule, because that way you could keep status quo. Whereas if you do not like the status quo, you should say that our countries or our voting bodies, voting rule should be simple majority rule. That way, changing status quo becomes easier. Okay? That is true in a group like this, 20, 30 people, but that is true for the whole nation. So when, say, a new country is born, and they write constitution, imagine founding fathers in the US or in the case of Korea, the first National Assembly, 제1국회, okay? If you like what's being set up now, you should say that the decision rule in the National Assembly should be near unanimity rule. If you want a systemic change later on, you should insist simple majority. Okay? Now that you understand how decision rules work, you gotta actually apply it in your life, okay? So in your life, whether it is dorm room situation, classroom situation, or 연애 situation, if you like status quo, insist on supramajority rule. If you want to change anything, then insist on simple majority rule. So as I just mentioned, decision rules affect political activity because they determine what political resources to seek and how to use them. So if the decision rule is simple majority rule, you don't need to mobilize lots of resources. If the decision rule is close to the unanimity, you have to convince lots of people, right? So it's going to take lots of resources or political capital. Likewise, here the question is, then how many vetoers are there? In a federal and decentralized system, such as the US, a pressure group may have to approach both the legislative and executive branch, and it may have to be active at the state and federal level, both of them. What this means is that decision-making power in the US is dispersed. Lots of people are involved in making decisions. Therefore, for you to make a change, you will have to convince lots of people. Since decision-making power is dispersed, you have to approach the legislative branch and executive branch or White House. And it's also a federal system, so you are going to have to approach central government as well as local government. So politics become more expensive now. Okay? If instead decisions are made by a single individual, a dictator, then there is only one veto, right? Then you will need to influence this crucial policymaker. So you can convince just one person and change the status quo or upset the status quo. You can get the change that you want by convincing one person. Okay? So decision rules are important. Here decision rules mean policy making rules are important because what we need to spend and whom we need to approach become different depending upon different decision rules. Let's push a little bit further today. Now, the most important distinction in political institutions is between democratic and authoritarian systems. Well, we've covered all this, right? So we are not going to spend lots of time on this one. And democracy means government by the people, the more democratic society that we are living in. However, as we also know, in large political systems, democracy must be achieved largely through indirect participation in policy making, right? So in a country like Korea with 50 million people, the ideal situation would be, well, the direct democracy, so 50 million people get together in, I don't know, the Yeouido Plaza, and then there's a presider over there. The President Park said those who are in favor and then those who oppose. Yeah. That's a direct democracy. But with 50 million people, it is simply not feasible, right? It is not realistic. So what is the second best? Indirect democracy. So we elect our representatives who will represent in the decision, represent us in the decision-making process. For that, elections, well, to choose our representatives, we gotta have elections, right? Competitive political parties, not the authoritarian ones, and free mass media gotta give us objective information, and representative assemblies, the legislature that truly represent us, the legislature that actually look like us. These are political structures that make some degree of democracy, some government by the people possible in large political systems. So for democracy to happen minimally, at the very minimal, we gotta have these things: elections, comparative political systems, free mass media, and representative assemblies. So we are not talking about maximal conditions. These are the minimal conditions that we need. Okay? In democratic systems, competitive elections give citizens the chance to shape policy through their selection and rejection of key policymakers. So here I'm going back to the general point that by electing someone or casting your vote for someone, you are not actually choosing that person, you are choosing the policy that that person represents. And in large societies, competitive elections with full adult suffrage are a necessary condition for a meaningful government by the people. Full adult suffrage means that all the adult persons, without a single exception, should have one vote. Right? That's a necessary condition. So for us to have democracy, well, we cannot have democracy without elections. Unless you are living in a country with a population of, 100 people, and you can always get together and make a decision together. Okay, so the most important distinction in the political institutions was a distinction between democracy and authoritarian rule. That much we don't need to discuss anymore. But on top of that, the basic decision rules of political systems differ along three important dimensions. The first is geographic distribution of authority between the central or national government and lower levels, such as states, provinces, or municipalities. That is, between the central government and local government, who has real power. Well, they could split the power equally. Okay? So depending upon who has more power, we can classify our system differently. That's the first dimension. Second dimension is the separation of powers among different branches of government. So under certain systems, executive branch can have more power than legislative branch, or vice versa. Okay. So when we discuss the political institutions, we got to look at how power is distributed geographically, and two, how power is distributed across different branches, and three, limitations on government authority. And this has to do with how much power judicial branch has over the decisions made by other branches. So we are going to discuss political institutions across these three dimensions one by one.